Robin Hood Radio and the Robin Hood Radio Network is proud to present Leonard Lopate at Large, lively hour-long in-depth discussions providing overviews and context to topics usually covered in partial measures. His guests include leading thinkers, scientists, artists, economists, farmers, historians, authors, and politicians. Mr. Lopate is a Peabody Award winner whose numerous honors include 3 Associated Press Awards and 3 James Beard Awards.
Welcome to Leonard Lopate at Large. I'm Leonard Lopate. In Feast, her new memoir from Little A Books, Hannah Howard tells the story of her lifelong struggle with food and eating disorders ranging from compulsive eating to anorexia and bulimia. And she describes her path from feeling like an outsider, unhappy with her body and her relationships, to becoming more self-confident and finally in control of her life. I'm very pleased to welcome Hannah Howard to our show now. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me.
As I said, you struggled with anorexia, bulimia, and compulsive eating throughout your youth. Is it at all ironic that you've spent many years working in restaurants and other food-related jobs? I would have thought that you would have done everything possible to avoid the obvious temptations.
I think the two are definitely connected, and looking back, although today I feel recovered from most of these struggles you've described with food and body image, I still have a love and joy for food. So I think there was a twofold inspiration for my career in restaurants and food. And the first was something positive, which was a genuine curiosity and love for food and sharing meals and cooking and the history and connection that can inspire. And then on the other side was something a little bit more dark and sinister, and that was my obsession with food. And I think just like there might be many alcoholics who work behind a bar, there's something about kind of the urge to control your demons or conquer those things by plunging into that universe. And so that attracted me too.
Did you find that some of the other people you were working with had similar issues?
Absolutely. The first story that I wrote where I kind of came out as a person with an eating disorder, which was something that I was really deeply ashamed of for a long time.
Where did you write that story?
For Vice, for Munchies, their food website, maybe about 3 years ago, was about the, maybe ubiquity is a little much, but about the commonality of eating disorders in the restaurant world. And I had never heard that discussed, and yet I had encountered it at every turn, whether it was, people I worked with who would spend all day talking about and just like their hands deep in this gorgeous food and not eat any of it, or the opposite, but just that there was on the facade just this glorious respect for food, but behind that the relationship with food was often much more complicated and difficult.
In speaking with chefs, I'm always surprised by how many of them are really thin and others have serious weight problems. There seem to be very few who are in between.
Yeah, it's a tough thing. I mean, I think our culture too is so kind of confused about food and our bodies and what's normal and what's okay. And I think in when food is your career and your life and you're living and breathing it, it just gets even more crazy.
But do you think that you would have had many of the problems that you discuss in this book, even if you hadn't gone into the food business? You write of always feeling like an outsider, although always, as you write, the tallest girl, towering and ungainly all through grade school. You say you were a dark-haired Jew in a sea of blondes. Where were you going to school?
So I grew up in Baltimore. I was just there yesterday at the Baltimore Book Festival. And I went to, my parents had intentions of sending me to public school, like the idealistic liberals they were. And when they visited the local public school in Baltimore City, they quickly changed their mind. And
why?
there were like needles on the playground. Most people did not go on to finish high school. It just wasn't a place that they saw for their child. And so they were a little last minute in trying to find a private school for me. And I received a wonderful education at Roland Park Country School in Baltimore. But I think that I always didn't really quite feel like I was at home there.
We're hearing about serious drinking problems in schools in Maryland these days. Was that an issue where you were?
Well, I moved away
to
New Jersey for high school, so I kind of missed the drinking problem era, but I think that that's probably common to New Jersey and Maryland and other places in our country.
But you said your goal when you were in high school was to become dainty and pert. You even had breast reduction surgery?
Mm-hmm. I had breast reduction surgery the summer between junior and senior years of high school. And in the book, I mentioned that, the first doctor maybe was reluctant to operate on someone so young, but I was so determined, and I had reached my current height, and we found someone who would do it. And I felt like it was something that was, looking back, I'm really glad.
And then you began yo-yo dieting. That was in your later high school years before you went to college?
Absolutely. I mean, I've always loved food, and I think I've loved food in a way that it was a little compulsive, that it wasn't just for satisfaction, but it was for cheering me up or calming me down. It was a distraction. It was a friend. And
at times, forgive me for interrupting.
Yes.
At times, it almost sounds rebellious because you have scenes where there's food put out for a lot of people, and you're the one who's dipping in more than anyone else, despite the fact that in one scene, your mother keeps on giving you looks like, "Stop doing that."
Right. Well, it's that tension in wanting that food and knowing as a woman from a very young age that that your body is supposed to be a certain way, which is thin, and that the consequences of that food are something else, and that sort of struggle. So my first attempts at dieting were failed ones because, I would skip lunch and then I would be hungry and then I'd eat too much, which I think is a normal biological thing because dieting is not the natural condition. But before I went to college in New York City, which was my dream and my fantasy, I dieted with a whole new zeal because I really wanted that body that matched my fantasy of my new New York life.
I'm sure most of your high school friends weren't compulsive eaters. Did this come up in conversations with them?
I think that so many of them maybe might have been. I think so many people, especially women, struggle with food, even if it's in a quieter way, or, even if it's not to the extent, it doesn't disrupt their life to their extent that it disrupted mine. But we did. People talked about dieting and everything, but at the same time, I had this idea that it was somehow unfeminist to have an eating disorder because I should be enlightened. And theoretically, I believed that different kinds of bodies should be beautiful and embraced. And yet when it came to me, I had such self-loathing and I couldn't really reconcile those things in my mind. So I was really embarrassed about my own food stuff, and I shared it with almost nobody.
Have you figured out why you had that self-loathing? Because you've been through therapy.
Mm-hmm. I think it sort of comes from hiding such a huge thing that you're going through. I don't know, it was maybe a cycle, why did I have this big secret and why did I feel like it needed to be a secret? And then once it was, I think that these ideas of food and body really pertain to the fundamentals of who we are in the world and the space that we take up in the world. And I wasn't okay with myself, and that's a really painful place to be.
And you write, you can't see an eating disorder. Thin people, fat people, normal people have this thing. We look like you.
Yes, I think there's a huge misconception that you must either be emaciated or hugely obese to have food issues, but so many of us do. And I think that kind of coming out about that has been really liberating and empowering.
Well, judgmental people say, well, why can't you just impose some willpower here?
I think that that's such a huge misunderstanding because I think we have so much willpower. I think the problem is not our individuals, but our cultural confusion about food and this idea. I mean, 90% of diets don't work. So we think, oh, it's our fault when we fail on a diet. But clearly, if you wouldn't take a medicine that was 10% likely to work. So I think that the problem is so much bigger than willpower.
You watch your mother on diets. Did that sour you on the idea of trying every diet that came along?
I think it definitely.
Did you try the paleo and?
Yeah, I mean, I tried all. About 6 years ago, I got into recovery and came to the hard-won conclusion that for me, diets are not the right way to deal with food. But before that, I think that was paleo hadn't come along as a big trend then. But I tried all the other things.
I'm speaking to Hannah Howard, who's written a book called Feast, which I thought could just as easily have been called Hunger.
But there is already a book by Roxane Gay called Hunger, which is a wonderful memoir, too.
Yeah, I guess too soon because, you can't copyright the title of a book. I can write a book called War and Peace.
Right.
But you wouldn't want to be confused with Roxane Gay, who's written a wonderful book.
Exactly.
Also dealing with issues of body, the way people judged her for her weight.
Mm-hmm. And I loved that in Hunger, she didn't come to some easy conclusion either. I think it wasn't about even body positivity. She struggles to be a person of a larger body in the world, and just leaving that be hard and not wrapping it up in some sort of neat bow is really refreshing.
So were you going back and forth between bulimia and anorexia?
So after this kind of gigantic diet to end all diets that I embarked on at the beginning of college, that was when I lost a lot of weight really fast, and my obsession became more and more sort of solidified in my brain. I received an anorexia diagnosis, and that sort of felt to me like a partial truth. Like, I was anorexic, and then I think I've always had sort of a compulsive eating brain. So that sparked maybe a 5-year-long cycle of binging, restricting for various lengths of time. And I had a lot of different sizes of clothes in my closet. I lost a lot of weight. I gained a lot of weight. And at neither of those ends of the spectrum was I ever happy or at peace with myself.
You say you were juggling the character traits associated with both eating disorders: people-pleasing, timid, perfectionistic, inflexible on the one hand, and impulsive, dramatic, and erratic on the other.
Right. And it's like I tried them all on for size and I couldn't win. But even in recovery, I think we do have, I had these after school special ideas of what a person with an eating disorder looked like. And in recovery, I've really come to see that all kinds of people have eating disorders and that those character traits are a very small portion of the truth.
I mentioned that your mother also did a lot of dieting, and you watched her. She went to Weight Watchers. And do you see this as being at all related to your mother's constant struggle over her weight?
I think my mother's struggle with her weight, I mean, I would never think to blame my mother for this, for my own struggle. I also kind of ended up writing about and then cutting some things about the way my dad ate. My dad was really, like, when I was a kid, really into low-fat everything and would eat, like, boxes and bags of things with zero fats, which is probably not... But everyone... I think that my mom's issues were just her personal... Our culture is so messed up about these things, and I think I got it from so many places, including my family, but that's only the beginning.
I've wondered a lot about low fat. For example, I have read that whole milk is actually healthier for you than low fat, and yet if you go to any supermarket to buy some yogurt, you're going to find tons of low fat or 1% fat yogurts with all sorts of artificial flavorings in them. It seems to me having plain whole milk yogurt might be a better idea, and yet so many people are committed to the other concept, thinking that they're going to control their weight.
I think that's exactly what it is, and I think at the end of it, it's who's going to make money from that. So, I was looking at the yogurt aisle, and there's this sort of, I can't remember the name, but it's this sort of power yogurt or something. It's supposed to be very manly. It has black packaging and like a flexed bicep on it. And I mean,
gee, I haven't seen that. I would have bought it.
But I think, people will be sold things that they believe are going to help them. And I write a lot about cheese, so I'm a big proponent of whole milk and dairy, but we have to eat what works for us.
And around the time when you were a senior in high school, didn't sex complicate the situation because you began you got involved with a troubled middle-aged manager of a gelato shop where you were working?
Yes. You
were still a minor.
Yes, I was. And I think that it's so easy when you're feeling so bad about yourself to sort of take the validation or affection where you can get it. And
It made you feel desired?
Absolutely. But it was, of course, looking back from the wrong place. But at the time, it seemed like kind of maybe doing something similar to what starving myself or binging was doing for me in a weird way.
I don't want to get too explicit in this conversation, but your early sexual relationships turned out to be as passionate and destructive as your eating disorders. Do you see the two related?
Yeah, I think that's why I wanted to write about them together in one book. And I think that sort of the themes of desire and using things that should be pleasurable in a way that was actually self-destructive resonated with both the food and these relationships.
The relationships must have been very difficult to write about because you're describing some very vulnerable situations.
Yes, they were more difficult than I bargained for. I kind of felt like those were in the past when I set out to write about them. And then I found that I sort of had to parachute back into the scene of the crime when I was writing about them, and that surprised me how hard that was to do.
And you write about rape. I suspect all of the talk about sexual abuse during the Kavanaugh hearings have stirred up some very awful memories.
Absolutely. And I actually just got back from my honeymoon. I just got married.
Congratulations.
And, thank you. So it was this really sort of joyful time in my personal life. And then we were watching the hearings on the TV from Jamaica. And, I know I'm not alone in feeling like really deeply angry and triggered and depressed and all sorts of things about what's going on with that.
But what happened is a lot of women who had suppressed or not discussed what had happened to them are now suddenly coming out and calling various helplines. Mm-hmm. Because this is something that just gets held in and kept to yourself.
Absolutely. I didn't discuss this with anyone for many years until after the fact. And I think I first shared it with a therapist. And I realized, and now I can see, and I think intellectually I always understood that it wasn't my fault. But I just wrote a piece that a composer, a friend of mine, set to music about this scene in the book called "I Should Have Taken the Train." And that was sort of one of the refrains. The rape happened in a car, and like if I had taken the train, I would have avoided it. But there's all these ways that we feel somehow responsible, and I think I felt like it was somehow my fault.
Well, I'm sure you've taken many car rides without anything terrible is happening.
Right.
But then you blame yourself for the one where something went wrong.
Of course. And of course, if a friend told me this story, it would be like laughable to me that they would think that it was their fault. But somehow, yet, when it happened to me, I internalized that responsibility.
And as we have seen recently, some people do blame the victim.
Right. Right, exactly.
You now mentor women recovering from eating disorders. Do most of them have difficulties with their romantic relationships as well?
I don't think that's fair to say. I think they don't have any more or less difficulty than the rest of us humans do in the world with romantic relationships.
Is working these issues out similar to trying to recover from substance abuse?
It's very similar. And in fact, for me, I tried a bunch of different things from diets to therapy, but the thing that really stuck and that really changed me from the inside was going to Overeaters Anonymous, which is a 12-step group. So it's very similar to what you would hear in an AA meeting or something.
And it's effective, or it was effective for you?
For me, it's changed my life for the better in so many ways that I didn't even know were possible. And I think the first thing that really, there's a lot of reasons maybe, but the first thing was just being able to go into a room and hear people talk about things that I thought were my unique brand of messed upness, and hearing that come out of another person's mouth and then see everyone like smile and give each other hugs. Wow, that just instantly healed something for me and continues to do so.
While you were still a freshman at Columbia University, you took a job at Picholine, Terrence Brennan's Michelin star restaurant near Lincoln Center. It's since moved, but he had a problem with rent?
I think the restaurant was around for a long time, and I worked there in 2006, I think, through 2007. And at the time, we would sometimes joke that the average age of our customer was like 75. So and then it hung around another 5 years after that. So I think it sort of got, it was a little stodgy, but I loved it. I loved that restaurant.
Well, he's a great chef.
Yes,
and
absolutely.
He had a cave downstairs, which was unique to that restaurant. But that must have been a difficult job to get. Did you just walk in and say, I like food?
It was the easiest job I've ever gotten. I applied from a Craigslist ad. I was a hostess, which is, I think good hosts are hard to come upon because I think I made $12 an hour. And it kind of fed into my eating disorder narrative because I thought I got the job because I was skinny and they wanted to project a certain appearance at the door.
And why were you skinny then? Dieting, or were you anorexic at that point?
Yeah, I was in the throes of the worst of my anorexia. But during that time, I'm so glad for it. I'm grateful. I met Max McKelman, who was their cheese guy at the time. And I fell in love with the cheese cart and the cheese program, and it was incredible.
Is cheese fattening?
Every food is fattening if you eat too much of it.
You say that you went for days on just yogurt and coffee, and that despite the fact you had to work really long hours sometimes, late into the night, because that's part of working at a restaurant. You must have been exhausted.
I was exhausted.
Because you didn't have any fuel in your body.
I was so deeply exhausted, and I think there's another scene later at the book at another restaurant job where I kind of like nearly collapse in the middle of a busy shift. But I think sometimes now when I'm exhausted, I have these flashbacks to that time because I was also in college, and it was really, I don't know how I did it.
You write of becoming fascinated by the emergence of your hip bone, the concave scoop above your clavicle. So you were examining your body for signs of success? Absolutely.
And I think, just these images that we're saturated with of these incredibly thin women, I had always felt like not enough. And then just, and a part of my brain always did, even with those pointy hip bones and the clavicle space. And yet another part of me was like, yeah, I'm doing this thing, was proud.
And then you took a job waiting tables?
Yes. So after Picholine, I worked at a wonderful cheese and wine bar that's still around where we had my book party called Casalula. It's in Hell's Kitchen, and I got to keep learning about cheese, and it was just such a vibrant, wonderful place.
And how long were you there?
I was there until I graduated from college, so 2.5 years.
I'm speaking with Hannah Howard, who has written a memoir called Feast, True Love in and Out of the Kitchen. It is published by Lopate, which is the publishing arm of Amazon?
Absolutely. It's the literary imprint. Amazon has several imprints, and it's their literary fiction and nonfiction imprint.
We'll get you back into the kitchen in a moment, but you also started writing and obtained an internship at Serious Eats blog?
Yes, I've always loved to write, and food blogs were just kind of emerging. And I remember going into my interview at Serious Eats, and I think they were asking about scrambled eggs and chocolate chip cookies, and I just felt like I had sort of met my people, these wonderful food nerds.
But I'm sure listeners are wondering if you were battling a combination of anorexia and bulimia, why didn't you just quit working in the food world and try to pursue a career as a writer?
I did want to pursue a career as a writer, but writing about food was my passion and also my obsession, and it was the thing that was always on my mind, so it felt so natural to be writing about that.
And what did you write about at the blog?
Well, my first kind of big story that took off, I did random, it was in the age where I think we did roundups of what they said in the New York Times and stuff like that before they realized that we didn't need to do that. But my first contribution was a article on being paid in tips because I was a waiter at the time. And someone else retweeted it, and it got some momentum, and that gave birth to a column that I wrote for Serious Eats called Served, which was behind the scenes working in restaurants stories.
What are your thoughts about tipping? Danny Meyer's trying to eliminate it. In Europe, tipping is not done the way it is in this country.
It's a really strange custom, I think. We're so used to it. Even when I go to Danny Meyer restaurants, I usually forget. And then when the check comes and there's not that little line to leave a tip, I'm confused. But you wouldn't, go to your doctor's appointment and then tip your doctor. Or, it's a really...
Sometimes with a doctor, I want a rebate.
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes you do at a restaurant too. And I think it's a weird institution that also sets up this disparity where people in the front of the house usually make significantly more than the cooks and the back of the house staff, which is not fair. So I think tipping is a silly practice, but I think we're so used to it that I know Danny Meyer is fighting hard to do what he's doing. And I know Casalula tried to eliminate tipping and then went back because they had to raise their prices. So it's tough.
And how does the staff feel about it?
You're
guaranteed. Yeah. You don't get the tip. Do you?
Mm-hmm.
You just get a higher salary?
Right. You make an hourly rate that's much higher than the really low hourly rate you can make because tips are expected to make the difference. I think it depends on the restaurant, it depends on so much. But I think that a lot of people at the Danny Meyer restaurants who were servers lost money when they went to hospitality included. And so they lost some wonderful staff. And so that's tough.
I've spoken to people who've worked in the kitchens of restaurants, expensive restaurants, and there's often a bit of resentment that the waiters come in not long before the restaurant opens. They've been there for a while, preparing, chopping vegetables or whatever. The waiters then, if they are lucky, have a wonderful table and get a lot of money in tips. And then they do a little cleanup and they leave, and the kitchen staff continues.
Still there, yeah. Yeah, and it's not fair. I don't think it's right. I think having worked mostly in the front of the house, but a little bit in the back of the house, I think those people work insanely hard and they're not compensated enough, and it's a huge problem.
But that's what they do? Or do they yearn to be in the front of the house?
No. I think, those who want to make it their career yearn to be the head chef, or the sous chef is usually compensated significantly more than a line cook, or to even have their own restaurant.
There are different traditions in France. Usually, when there's a husband and wife involved, the husband is in the kitchen and the wife is in the front of the house. And in Italy, the husband is in the front of the house and the wife is in the kitchen.
Oh, yeah. I just visited, I went to go learn about Pecorino Toscano in Tuscany, but we visited a restaurant where it was the husband in the back of the house and the wife in the front of the house. So I guess, it depends.
Working at Picholine and waiting tables at Casalula must have been rather exciting. You write about how much you loved New York, but after graduation, you moved to Los Angeles, where you trained to run a high-end steakhouse in Pasadena. Why did you make that decision? And were you still struggling with your eating disorders?
Yes. So it was 2009 when I graduated. So it was serious recession time. And I think also just most of my peers did not know what we wanted to do with our lives after college. And I had really fallen in love with the adrenaline, the excitement, the food, a lot from restaurants. And I thought, why not pursue this? And I got a job offer from a chain steakhouse that runs about 50 restaurants throughout the country. And I don't think they're going to sue me. They're Hillstone or Houston's. And it just seemed like, it had a paycheck, it had a signing bonus. They were going to move me to LA. It seemed like a good opportunity. And even though I hated it, it did turn out to be a good opportunity.
Well, you probably learned something about the restaurant business.
I learned so much. They had this incredible program where their training managers worked in every single position in the restaurant. So we were a host and a server and a line cook, but we even were an accountant and did the books. And we learned about like the air conditioning system, and we learned everything about their restaurants.
And did you like being a line cook?
Certain aspects of it I loved. There's still something I miss about finishing a really busy, really good shift. It's like sort of a dance, and you're so in the moment. It's intense, but it's satisfying. You're creating something, and then at the end of the night, you've done something. And there's a camaraderie. You don't get that from writing. But it's also repetitive. It's also exhausting. It's also mind-numbing sometimes.
And you say you're creating something, but I remember speaking to a famous chef. I'm not going to mention the name because it's a bit embarrassing. And he said he was at war with one of his line chefs who kept on suggesting other ideas. And he just wanted the line chef to cook his food. That line chef eventually left and wound up having a 3-star Michelin restaurant.
Amazing.
In Brooklyn.
Right, but I think you're getting to the heart of why or what there's nothing creative about it. You have to execute someone else's recipe down to the minutia, and I knew that wasn't going to be satisfying long term, but it was fun to do for a little while.
And then you moved to Philadelphia, where you managed what you call an American Italianish restaurant. And your boyfriend was the chef?
Yes. So I was complaining to my mom over the phone about hating my job in LA, and she happened to be sitting next to someone at the bar when I called who owned a restaurant and was looking for a restaurant manager. And it was the most random thing, but it seemed too good to refuse. And eventually we needed a new chef, and I had started dating someone who was a cook in New York City, and he came and moved to Philly and moved in with me and became the restaurant's chef.
And aware of your food issues, I assume?
I mean,
How soon did you, while you were in a relationship, did it take before you revealed that you had these issues?
I don't think I ever revealed that I had these issues. I think, we both had issues with food too, and I think if he was paying attention, or if anyone was paying attention, they would have noticed. But it was, at that time, it was something I never spoke about.
And when you returned to New York, you worked in the cheese department at Fairway Market. From what you've been saying about cheese, that must have been your dream job.
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember too, I had broke up with this chef in Philly, and he gave me a hard time, like, you're going to work in a grocery store? And I was like, you don't understand, it's Fairway. But I had been doing some freelance writing on the side, and I had interviewed Steve Jenkins, who was their cheese and olive oil guru, and on a whim, I kind of asked if they were hiring. And at the time they were growing really fast. And he said, we don't know what we're going to do with you, but we'll figure it out. And that was such a cool opportunity.
And your opening chapter takes place while you were working at Fairway and describes what you've called your epic last binge at the home of friends of your parents, where all the food that they put out was quite wonderful, and your mother was constantly letting you know that she disapproved of what you were doing, and yet that didn't seem to deter you from scarfing down everything. Was that really your last binge?
Yes. I mean, since then, I've definitely eaten feasts, or, I've eaten meals that are probably or definitely more than I need to fill my stomach. On the other hand, I haven't since then consciously set about to hurt myself with food, which is what I feel like a binge is at the heart, like using food as a drug or using food as a weapon against myself. I haven't done that since then.
And you see it's a weapon against yourself? Why were you fighting with yourself?
I think that's like the mystery that I don't know if I can answer. I mean, that's whatever is the eating disorder. I think that's what it is. And I think it is some sort of fundamental dissatisfaction with myself or lack of love for myself.
And I mentioned earlier you mentor other people with these problems. You've been through 12-step programs where you met a lot of other people who shared these problems. Do you think that they were all at war with themselves?
Yes, I think that...
Why do you think that is? I mean, you're an attractive woman. There's no reason for you to have been angry with yourself.
Wow. Right.
Forgive me for saying that. I'm not a senator, so I can say that.
No, of course. I think, right, it doesn't make, and people have said to me, but you're not, there are people who are obese, and I'm not one of them. But I think that I kind of talk in the book a little bit about this, feeling lonely, feeling like I had a sort of ambition that couldn't be quenched, or all of these things. It's a sort of coming of age story. And I think people have different reasons for having an eating disorder, but I do think it's a sort of like Venn diagram between our culture that really tells you have to look a certain way, people's own biology, and, whatever their brain is doing. And it kind of, it happens.
Well, yeah, I was thin as a rail for most of my life, and then I quit smoking.
There you go. Yeah, and I've met people in OA who, never struggled with food, and then they, stop drinking or whatever it is. And so it can happen to anyone.
You've also done bartending.
Yeah, a little bit of bartending.
Did you go back to school when you realized that you wanted to write?
No, I've always realized I've wanted to write, but in fact, I got my MFA acceptance and my book contract, I think, in the same week. But I did go back to school because writing has always been a love of mine, but it has been a little bit on the periphery of my life, and I kind of wanted to shift it to the center of my life and take it really seriously. And I'm so glad that I did that and that I have.
And when you started on this book, did you pretty much know what you wanted to write about?
I did know what I wanted to write about. I had written some essays about different things, and I felt that they were adding up to something bigger, and that these kind of disparate topics of the love and the relationships, the restaurants and the food, and the eating disorder recovery felt like they belonged together in my mind, and I just had to put that on paper. The challenge was I've never written a book before, and knowing how to create something cohesive and that felt like one thing instead of a million little pieces, that was really hard for me.
One of the ways I guess you saw as tying everything together was your chapter headings.
Absolutely. The chapter headings are names of foods. And I had...
Which you talk about in the chapter.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And that came later, in fact. I think one of the biggest revelations in tying things together was beginning that first chapter with my last binge, kind of using, I mean, the arc of recovery is a really nice story arc. It's like you have a struggle and then you have hopefully some sort of peace with that struggle. And so that kind of became the form of the book.
Did writing your story affect your sense of confidence and control?
Yeah, I did have this idea that writing was going to be somehow cathartic, and I know,
I'm sure everybody's asked you, has this been a cathartic experience?
Yeah. In fact, it was so much harder than I thought. I mentioned I felt like I had to relive these things, kind of the worst of it, because that's what's the juicy, interesting parts are the painful parts. But so that was hard, and I actually ended up going back to therapy for the first time in a while. And but what has been really cathartic and wonderful is getting to talk about the book. I feel like that's such a joy, and I was terrified to put this vulnerable stuff into the world, and being met with people who say like, "Oh, I've been there too," has been really healing in some way.
So when you do book signing, readers tell you that they recognize themselves in some of the things you've written about? Absolutely,
and I get messages and Facebook messages and Instagram messages saying like, this is my story too, and that's kind of, that thrills me because that's what I was hoping for. And I think I kind of wrote what I needed to hear as an 18-year-old.
And you write, well, first of all, let me tell my listeners who you are. Hannah Howard, in case you just tuned in, she's written a memoir called Feast, True Love in and Out of the Kitchen, published by Little A Books. You write very candidly about your relationships, including with some probably identifiable people in the food and restaurant world. Did you struggle at all with how open and honest you wanted to be in regard to some of the people you're writing about?
Absolutely. I wanted to be, I wanted to tell my story, but I didn't want to create pain or harm for anyone else. So I kind of used honesty and kindness as my guideposts, and things did get cut. I was really glad for a legal read, which I didn't know was part of the process for memoir, and I'm really glad it is. And that was kind of helpful too, just to have someone say like, just change a few things. But I tried my best. Someone said, I'm not sure, maybe Anne Lamott, like, if you don't want someone to write about you being a jerk, don't be a jerk. So kind of took that to heart a little bit.
In light of some of your stories that you tell here, and some of the scandals that we've been reading about recently in the restaurant world with celebrity chefs and restaurateurs, would you recommend that a young woman work in this business?
I think that there's a lot of terribleness in the restaurant world and in the bigger world, but there is also a lot of wonderfulness, and there are people doing great things, and there's a lot of women-owned. I just went to King, which is a women-owned restaurant in Soho, which was amazing, and I think my advice would be to be really careful about the people that you invite into your work life and life.
So the trick is to go to work at a restaurant where everybody in all the restaurant people are women.
Maybe. I mean, that being said, I used to work after the end of this book. I worked for Ken Friedman,
who's one of the people who's been in the papers.
Absolutely, very briefly, and I didn't know about the sexual harassment, but I did know he was not a good guy, and that was one of the reasons that lasted so briefly. But I think that that there's hopefully that this is sparking a change of culture, and I think there's a long way for it to go, but I think that there's definitely some hope and there is some change happening.
Well, I suspect some of the things that we've been reading about have been going on in the restaurant world for a very long time, but then again, they've been going on in every other business.
Absolutely. But I think there is something particular about the restaurant business, whether it's the crazy hours, the nature that they're often small businesses with no HR departments, the sort of personal aspect of a sort of family atmosphere that gets created that could be a really beautiful thing, or it could be a really destructive thing.
And then there's that sense of us against them, often, the staff against the customers.
Right.
And then I remember years ago I was very friendly with, unfortunately she's no longer with us, Josefina Howard, who created the Rosa Mexicana, the first Rosa Mexicana restaurant. And they opened up a second restaurant, and she said, I'm having real problems because the bartender that my partners hired is selling cocaine on the side. And she was having a hard time trying to get rid of him. And there was a lot of that went on in that world as well.
I think that still continues.
Does it?
Absolutely.
You've done some copywriting and marketing writing over the years as well. Is that good training for writing something much more personal like this book?
I don't know if it's good training. It's very important to me because it's how I pay my rent. And it's kind of nice to get to write something that isn't about me once in a while, and to just focus on, I work for some cheese companies and some food importing companies.
Back to those cheeses.
Yeah.
I did a whole show, by the way, with 2 artisanal cheesemakers, and it was fascinating.
Yes, I've spent a lot of time visiting cheesemakers, and cheese is still one of my great loves, and I continue to write about it. And the challenge there is trying to say, at first when I worked at Fairway and I had to write descriptions of cheese, it was like, oh, this is so fun. And then when you get to brie number 17, you have run out of adjectives.
But they do taste different.
Absolutely. But, some more different than others.
Has writing taken on some of the obsessive aspects that eating used to for you?
I don't think so. I think writing has been with me throughout my life for the really good times and the really bad times, but for some reason I'm able to kind of put it away at the end of the day.
And are you working on any new writing project?
Yes, I am trying to sort of figure out what that is, but I have an idea about a series of profiles of badass women in food. So that's kind of what's brewing.
You just got married, you said. Is your husband in the food world?
My husband is an amazing appreciator of food, but he works for Bloomberg and is not professionally a food person, which is kind of nice that we have some separation of what we do.
What happens when somebody who works in this business is cooking at home? Can you separate the two? Do you become the home cook as opposed to the restaurant cook?
It's such a different thing. It's such a different experience. For me, the biggest difference is that time pressure. I don't think I could ever be a great cook in a restaurant because I could never be fast enough. And at home, I don't have to be, and I can take my time and kind of try something, and it might not work, and the only people who will suffer are me and my husband, I guess.
Do you feel you're totally over the hump as far as the food issues are concerned?
I think I'm a million miles from where I used to be. I think that this will always be a part of me and something that I have to be vigilant about and take care of. And I still have stuff that comes up, but it's not the biggest stuff in my life anymore.
If you met a young woman who you knew was anorexic, or actually you saw forcing herself to throw up, would you say something?
Yes, I don't think you can force anyone to recover, but I wish people had just said to me, like, I've been there, it can get better. You're not necessarily stuck with this forever. I thought that I was going to be stuck with this for forever. So I think just that sort of solidarity and camaraderie goes a long way.
My great thanks to you for being on our show, Hannah Howard. Her book, Feast, True Love, In and Out of the Kitchen.
Thank you so much.
And that brings us to the end of our show. My great thanks to Hannah Howard, to Charlie Morrow, who composed our theme music, to Reggie Johnson, who was at the audio controls, and to my assistant producer, Jesse Lent, who makes things run smoothly. Lopate at Large comes to you on Saturdays at 4 and Tuesdays at noon. You can subscribe to Leonard Lopate at Large podcast on iTunes and by clicking on Robin Hood Radio's archive program site, which is robinhoodradio.com. You can also check out Leonard Lopate at Large Facebook page. We hope to see you next week.